Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the next webinar of Productivity and Profitability webinar series. This series is being brought to you by MLA, Meat and Livestock Australia, and Agrista. The MLA Productivity and Profitability series is designed to assist sheep, cattle, and goat producers to increase productivity and profitability of their business. The series will provide timely technical information relevant to producers across Australia. My name is Ellie Hayes and I am a consultant with Agrista, and I'll be your host for tonight's webinar. In this webinar, we are thrilled to have Natalie Johnson join us to discuss performing under pressure. When seasonal conditions throw up operational challenges and decisions must be made. What can we do to manage high stress workloads and pressure? So before I hand over to Natalie, I would like to cover off some housekeeping of the webinar. Tonight's webinar is being recorded and a copy of the recording will be available on the Agrista and MLA websites. We invite you to ask questions for Natalie throughout the webinar, and we will address them at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, please head over to slido.com and enter in the code November or NOV 2024. To gauge our audience tonight, I would like to start with a short introductory survey for you all to fill out. You can simply scan the QR code on the screen to access Slido if you haven't already logged in. I won't display all the answers here, but I did think a good one to display on screen to show is what best describes your role in industry. So I'll give you a bit of time to finish these answers. If you are just joining, we just got a small questionnaire to gauge who's in the room. If anyone's having struggles, here we go. I will wait for a few more to enter in questions. If you are just joining us, we've just got a small questionnaire to gauge who's in the room. If you just scan that QR code, and it'll give you a few questions. I'll give it one more minute. Oh, here we go, a few more answers. Oh, 50-50. Righto. I'll keep going, but you can answer that throughout the night as well. So for those of you that don't know Natalie grew up in regional Western Australia and made history as the first female pilot for the Royal Australian Navy. With 24 years of military service under her belt, she has held various roles, including qualified helicopter instructor, operations manager, and safety professional. Throughout her career, Natalie gained valuable insights into human behaviour, error management, resilience, decision-making, and the impact of organisational culture. She has over 15 years of experience in helicopter training, risk management, safety investigation, and fostering positive safety cultures. Since retiring from full-time service, Natalie has launched her own business, offering training and consulting in human factors and safety management systems. She delivers workshops and keynotes across diverse sections such as aviation, hospitality, agriculture, mining, and government. Natalie now resides on the south coast of New South Wales with her husband and 2 children. I will pass over to you now, Natalie. I'll just stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Ellie, and hopefully you guys can see my screen. Thanks so much for Agrista and MLA for having me this evening, and all of you for taking time out of your busy time to come and listen to me talk. You may hear that I am a little bit nasal. If I stop to blow my nose, it's my kids have been sharing their viruses as they do when they come home from school. But what I'm going to talk about today is kind of share my experiences and the things that I've learned both from a theoretical and also a practical knowledge, to share with you kind of things that we do to understand and manage workload and understand to manage pressure on ourselves and how we can perform to our maximum ability. So we'll start with a little bit of background. And as Ellie said in the introduction, I did grow up in Western Australia. I always used to say the wheat belt until I spoke to a couple of guys in South Australia and we realised that the wheat belt is the size of South Australia, so it doesn't really narrow it down. I grew up in a small country town called Cuballing, which is about 200 k's southeast of Perth. We moved around different farming organisations with my dad. He was a policeman, then went back to farming. And he was a farm manager on very large properties, and then we bought our own small acreage, which we did a lot of mixed business. So we liked to diversify. It was my dad's key word. So we did have cropping and mostly oats and oat and hay for small bale for the equine market. But a lot of it was sheep. So merinos, crossbreds, and then later on we diversified into cattle and into pigs and goats. And also at one stage during a couple of Christmases, we ran turkeys. So it's been a pretty interesting childhood growing up in that space. But I think in that space is one of the things that back in the sort of late 80s, early 90s is things weren't run about the theme of being safe or managing risk. It was all about common sense, about doing what had to be done to get the job done in the time frame required with the resources you had. And intrinsically within that was the safe practices. But as you know, there are a lot of accidents within farming that could be prevented because sometimes we don't potentially think about the real consequence of some of the things we do. And I didn't really learn about that until I started on my aviation career. I started in high school and thought, wow, this is probably going to be better than driving a truck, which was my plan, and decided to fly a plane instead, and then ended up joining the Defence Force. So it was a bit of a steep learning curve. And when I started in the Navy, we were only first starting to develop things like risk management. And we're very early on the process of the crew resource management and human performance, which I want to talk a fair bit about tonight. So that's the background. One of the things I've discovered over the last few years doing this is that there are actually a lot of similarities between aviation, and particularly military and Navy aviation, and farming. And probably some of you on the call are going, don't be ridiculous. But if you think about it, we do operate and rely on the ever-changing environment. So the weather dictates how we fly or how we operate and what we do. And it's very much that process and understanding that to bring into and changing our processes depending on what the weather is like, how we fly. Do we fly instrument conditions? Do we fly what we used to call grub navy, which is down low as far as we can to get away from the weather? The other part of it is it's very much people orientated. So we do have distinct roles, like I was a pilot, but also like in farming, you're not just one thing. I was a pilot, I was also the safety officer or the operations officer or the flight commander. I also had numerous roles when we went to sea. And so we had to diversify it and manage it. So the workload wasn't just in the aircraft. It was about managing people, about managing systems, and about managing tasking. So it got bigger. So there was a lot of coordination to achieve a task, because for us to get airborne and go and do something, particularly at sea, it required a fairly large maintenance team. It required our aircrew, which usually consisted of 2 pilots and 2 aircrew in the back, 1 rescue crew and 1 sensor operator, and also the flight deck team of the ship and also the ship drivers. And so the team was massive. So it required a lot of clear communication and coordination to get that done. But sometimes it didn't work. The other thing that's similar is things changed at short notice, particularly within my environment, and I know it does within yours as well. And it depends on dynamic changes of whether that's the price of cattle or feed, the weather changing, paddocks changing, operations, expectations, technology changing, and how you manage that. I think there are so many similarities. The one thing I think we do all have in both organisations and both industries is resilience. But I suppose we all talk about that a lot now, but what is it? So I'm going to start with a little definition. This is a dictionary definition of resilience. I think it's a little bit lacking, because if you just bounce back to the same place, if something similar happens again, you potentially will be hit the same way. You will suffer the same consequences. So I think for us to be really resilient is we need to bounce back and then learn and understand why something happened, or why a certain event occurred, or why we made certain decisions, for then us to be able to then learn from it and move forward, because that is the only way we can actually increase our profitability, improve our business, and change the way we operate to enable that resilience to happen. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about a story of or an experience that I had during my flying training. I was towards the end of my operational flying training, which is the marker point that basically confirms you as a naval aviator. Prior to that, you're a trainee pilot still. And this meant you were wings confirmed, you were allowed to be an aircraft captain and take it out. So if you set yourself in the scene, if you think about it in the space of maybe driving a ute across a very barren paddock at night and you've turned your lights off. That's pretty much what it feels like when you're flying out over water in the dark at night time. There is a featureless landscape, not much moon on this particular night, and we also didn't have night vision goggles at the time. So it didn't have that, and they don't turn it day into night, but they do aid you significantly, and a lot of things are much easier with them on. But we didn't have them at this time. And this particular flight was what we called a chop ride. And they actually drew an axe with fake blood dripping off it on our board to indicate if you fail this flight, you're out, you're done. Or you would get another chance, but you're pretty close. So it's a very important flight to go through. So if you think about that in that context, there was a fair bit of pressure on myself to perform, to achieve. And you get bombarded with questions on your way out. So you're flying out in the dark, you're getting bombarded with questions about parameters of the aircraft, about processes we have to follow. And we get down into the hover, and we're pretty much simulating search and rescue exercises over the water at night time. And we're down as the hover low over the water, and your instructor will give you simulated emergencies. And most of these will put the aircraft in an abnormal state. So you had to deal with them effectively and efficiently, otherwise you could risk the safety of the aircraft and crew, because the aircraft wasn't operating as it normally would. So as we were flying down there, on the questions on the way out, I started to get a lot wrong, things that I expected to get right. And if anyone's been in that situation where you have an expectation on yourself to do certain things and you're not achieving that expectation, there's that level of frustration or that level of disappointment that flags in. And that started to happen, and that started to build. And because that started to build, my performance got worse. And then I made more mistakes. And then each time we had an emergency, I made more mistakes. And it built and it built and it built. So at one point we were coming in around, we were 200 feet off the water, going at 100 knots, which is about 180 kilometres an hour. and we were about to enter a descent. We just started a descent down towards the water to simulate rescuing someone out of the water. And at this point, my instructor gave me a fairly significant emergency. So it's dark. The first thing you see is a bright red flashing warning light. And you start to try and react and diagnose what it is and carry out the correct actions to keep the aircraft safe. I did that very poorly. So I was so disappointed and frustrated in myself that that emotion eventually switched my brain over, and the physical reaction was I started crying. And my decision posed because of that was to stop talking, because it wasn't acceptable to cry for me at that stage, because crying was seen as being weak. It was seen as being a way people got their own way, particularly the women. And when you're in a minority, this became quite difficult. So I'd really kind of pose for all of you to think about while I'm talking about this is how do you or would you react if someone working next to you or within your family or something, when you're out doing a task, if they showed some sort of intense emotion, how do you deal with it? How do you react? Because of the way I thought my crew would react, I was fearful that they would respond poorly. So I decided to stop speaking. So we're going to talk a little bit now about what that meant or why that happened. So part of it is about understanding your state. So understanding the human performance limitations, because, you know, you will all be aware, and this is pretty much the basis of a lot of human factors. And I've taught this in the past, and when it first got introduced, a lot of people use it as, oh, it's just a list of excuses for people who aren't able to do their job. Now, for me, I find that really hard because it's actually a list of ways of learning how to prevent issues from happening in the future. So it's building resilience. It's about understanding what things are in your control within your organisation that you can adjust, and how you can effectively manage your workforce so they're motivated to come. So within human performance limitations, it looks at a couple of things of your health and well-being, your physiological state. So that's sleep, nutrition, physical health, basic exercise, all of those sorts of things. And like for me at the moment with my head cold, I'm probably not at my 100%, but I'm trying, I'm getting there. The motivation though is why are you doing what you're doing? And it's about that intrinsic versus extrinsic. So are you just doing it because you get paid, or are you doing it because you have a passion for it, because you actually care for and love the animals or the farm or the environment that you work in, because you're ingrained and it's part of your sort of body and just what you do. I know it was for my dad. It was farming and everything, and being in that space was just part of who he was. And I don't think, because he definitely wasn't doing it for the money, and I understand that. But the motivation of why you and your workers are there and doing that task is really important to understand. The other part is the interaction with others. And that thing that I talked about in the aircraft, that fear that I have about how my crew members would react, made me make a certain decision or drove me in a certain direction to make the decision to stop speaking. The other part is the ergonomics and anthropometric space you're in. So for me, I was a lot smaller. I had a lot smaller head than most people in military aviation. So my helmet never fit properly. So when I was particularly under training, I had to deal with it not fitting properly, being really uncomfortable and causing pain. And that impacted my ability to perform at my best, because that was distracting me. It was sitting in the background. I could feel it. So that's really important to make sure the equipment you give your crew and your team, is it fit for purpose? Is it what they need? And does it fit them? Because if it fits them, they feel included and it's part of what you do. And all of these things, if you understand your state and where you're at, can help you deal with increased pressure and workload. It is part of the cognitive part as well. So the mental health and your decision making, biases, making things look the way you think it should, or making assumptions based on somebody's background or what they've done before. Those sorts of things can influence our decision making and also can potentially make us make the wrong decision. And that all comes down to pretty much the impact and influence of everything around us. So you sit in the middle of this. And while you're sitting in the middle, is you're the self in the middle, and the environment has an impact, and not just the physical weather and climate, but also the environment of the workplace. Do you feel safe to be at work? Do you feel safe to speak up? The processes you've got in place, are they simple? Are they overcomplicated? Do people hate them? Do people do their best to work around them? Are they fit for purpose again? The equipment, we've spoken about that. And the other people, how do you interact with the other people? And then the culture of your organization is how it feels to be in the space, how things are done around there. Do people call each other out? Do people consider safety first or consider risk? Is there an element of additional pressure, and is that pressure from you or others? And I'll talk a little bit more about perceived and actual pressure later. And all of that influences our decisions and behaviours. But then our decisions and behaviours then impact the culture, then they impact how we interact with all of those things. So it is a bit of a pulling and pushing as you go back and forth between this kind of combination of influences and impacts. And that takes us on to stress and workload. So stress and workload has an influence on all of that. So the push and pull as you go in from self out to decisions and behaviours and back in again, the stress and workload added together, look at the pressure. So this is a study that was done a long time ago of the Yerkes-Dodson law, and it basically talks about arousal, which is really stress, is how we look at it. So it shifts in the stress curve with workload. So if you have no workload, like now, you're probably sitting back, relaxed, potentially listening to this while doing something else. Your arousal levels are probably relatively low, maybe relaxed sitting there. There's not much demand on your thinking. You're in that lower space. So if something happened really suddenly, you'd probably be slower to react. It's the same if you think about it. If you're on a long drive somewhere, or for any of you cropping or doing anything for a long distance mustering for a long period of time at a slow speed or even a fast speed, if there's not much change. So think about driving the Hume Highway. If you're driving that, there's not much stimulation. It's constant noise, constant speed, little change. You will be in that low arousal state. And because of that, it means that if that kangaroo jumps out at the last minute, or somebody in front of you stops suddenly, or something changes, your reaction time will be extended. So it's really important to understand where you are in this curve. To be completely alert and focused, there needs to be a level of stress, a level of alertness, a level of stimulation that engages you. But as you go, and your knowledge and your experience will adjust how fat and wide that curve goes and how it shifts and changes depending on the workload. The more experience, the more knowledge you have, the more learning you've done, the ability for you to operate that stress or the optimal arousal point will actually get wider and spread out further. It means you can operate in larger range of stress environments, and things that may tip someone else over the edge, you'll be able to handle in your stride. And that's part of the thing, understanding your state and where you are and where you're feeling. So if you're fit and healthy and those limitations that we talked about before aren't impacting you, that curve will be quite wide. But if you're not feeling great, if you're distracted by something going on at home, if there's other things happening in your life, the curve will get narrower and narrower because you don't have much bandwidth to actually cope with new things that are coming along. So the workload and pressure work hand in hand. So workloads, you can add that. And the difference with pressure is the fact that pressure is usually something that you put on yourself, or it can come from an external source. And that external source could be the bank. It could be other livestock. It could be your animals itself causing you some pressure or workload as you go through, And so there's this thing that I talk about with actual versus perceived pressure. Actual pressure is that thing that comes from that external point. So that you have to get something done by a certain time frame because somebody else is depending on you. The only way you can amend and adjust actual pressure is communicate. Is you talk to the other person, you talk to the other entity that is driving that pressure, and communicate with them that it either can't be done in that time frame or you need additional resources. And this is a part is in within your organization, within your farm, within your work group. Do you allow people to actually communicate when the actual pressure is too much, when they can't cope with it, when it is driving the workload too high? Because when that happens, they fall off the end of that stress curve. The perceived pressure is that thing we put on ourselves. If you think back to my story, there was a little bit of actual pressure to get the course done and complete it, but there was a lot of pressure I put on myself, being the only female pilot, to prove that I was worthy, to prove that I could do it, to prove that I was there because I was capable and competent, not because they needed a token female. So that perceived pressure is often something that we put on ourselves based on what we think are the expectations on us. And the only way we can do that is actually you need to sit back and take a look. Is this real? Is this actually required, or can I sit back? And then again, you have a look at your state. You may be wondering what happens in that flight that I spoke about earlier. If you think about it, it was the first of many lessons for me. But if you go into that space, so I decided to be silent. So if you think about the rest of the crew at this point, the aircraft is moving towards the water at about 100 kilometres an hour. We're descending at about 100 feet per minute. So we're only at 200 feet, so it's not going to take us long to impact. And the person who normally talks quite a lot has gone, and the aircraft has a simulated emergency. The person who talks quite a lot, being me, goes completely silent. There was a moment of confusion and a moment of discussion amongst the other crew, but I couldn't speak because the only way they would know I was crying was if I spoke, because they could hear it over the radio because they couldn't see me. But fortunately, my instructor took over and he actually thought I had a radio or intercom failure. So he said, well, we can't continue, so we'll call it quits for the night anyway. And I hadn't been doing very well, so, I wasn't overly upset about that at that point. But it was just almost like a point of release when he took over and said, we're calling it quits. I thought about continuing with the intercom failure thought processes, but I realized as soon as I got back, the maintenance team and our survival equipment team who tested their helmets would have said there's nothing wrong with it. And then I would have been in a very awkward position. So I did tell them what had happened. And I did fail that flight, and you know what? The world didn't come crashing down. It wasn't so bad. And I actually found I got a lot of support from the guys, and that fear that I had of their reaction to me crying was actually unfounded. So it was really important to make sure in your organizations that you keep that space so people understand that they can express and they can communicate, because that will ensure that you know where they are in their performance. And you know that you shouldn't put them on a very strict or tense or intense task when they're not at their best, when they're potentially being distracted or issues happening elsewhere. So the lessons I learned out of that was a couple of things. So I hadn't been sleeping well. I just moved into my own place, a little flat. There'd been break-ins locally. I didn't have a deadlock on my door. I wasn't sleeping very well. Also, because I just moved out on my own, I'd been used to living on the mess on the base, where I sat down, someone fed me, someone took it away, and that's repeated for every meal pretty much. To then cook for yourself and start that whole process. Exercise went out the window because it's the easiest things to stop doing, and I didn't really have that routine and schedule. A stress had built from the environment because it was a dark night. There was lots of stuff happening. This fact that it was a test flight, that was getting emergencies and questions added to the stress, increased that workload significantly. That perceived pressure that I told you about to perform for me, to prove myself. So I did. I fell off the end of that curve. I fell well off and was right into the other space. And because of that, I was distracted, the workload, I was very overwhelmed. So what we call situational awareness is when you know what's happening and can predict or anticipate what's happening next. It disappeared. And then that reaction, that response. So I'd switched my brain from the analytical, the thinking brain, into that animal space and went into my flight, fight and freeze response. And it's basically was the I'm not sure which one it was, but probably the flight response. And it created that physical reaction of crying. And the culture of that, as I talked about, that expectation that that wouldn't be received well, impacted my decision making. I was underconfident at the time, but this can also happen when you're overconfident. If you think you've got it and you know what's going on, it leads to biases when you're thinking, and it changes and impacts your decisions. You think you know what's going to happen and you haven't done all the research, or you haven't had a look at all the scenarios, and you make a decision and then afterwards you go, oh, well, that was the wrong one. But it's important to learn from that. It's that doubt and uncertainty again, and it goes back to that culture, that decision making, the decision to stop speaking because I didn't want them to hear me crying. And then it led down to communication failure. I had to fail that flight because I risked the safety of the aircraft and the crew for not talking. So I had a significant impact on the others. They were a little bit concerned for a period of time there. And it definitely impacts teamwork. So the lessons kept recurring, and I kept learning more and more through my career. And then when I started becoming an instructor myself, we realized how important this stuff is, and how important it is to understand where those pressure points are, where you fall off the end of the curve, and learn those for yourself and know where that point is where you're not performing at your best. Because if you can understand your state, you can understand when to defer, delay, or potentially pass it on to someone else, to delegate. So as an instructor, we would push the students so they could build resilience. We'd find out where that point was they'd fall off, because we were working in very dynamic, and we needed them to be able to respond, because we needed them to end up doing like that aircraft in the top, to be flying at sea, potentially at night, to a moving vessel while other stuff is going on, and keep the aircraft, the crew, the ship, and everyone around there safe and achieve the mission. So we would push them until they would potentially fall off the curve. And then we would talk about it in the debrief to make sure they learnt the lesson, so they understood why the workload at that point took them over the edge, to understand what the controls were or the things they could do to put in place, things like breathing exercise, things like focusing on the things that they can change. But as instructors as well, because we're working in such a dynamic environment, like if anyone has taught someone how to drive or to ride a motorbike or ride a horse or something like that, where you're there giving instruction, but you don't have control, this is kind of similar. But the difference is when we're flying, we get to have control. So if the student is doing really badly, we can take over. But we would go to a point where the instructor would try and take over at the last minute, so the student would learn the lesson. But part of that as instructors, we would talk about managing errors, and we'd anticipate to improve our awareness of what errors the students would happen next. And through that, we'd also look at managing the error condition. And this was also managing and looking at errors and error conditions was brought into our maintenance team post an accident in 2005, and they started to learn about the importance of human performance and human factors. So when we talk about managing common errors, this is also one of the things that people talk about as a list of excuses where people can't do their job. But if you get these things right, then your organisation or your community or your family work really well. If you get them wrong, they can have significant impact. And I'd like to have a think and be keen for you guys to jump into the Slido so we can talk about it towards the end about, has anyone had an incident or something happen where has resulted because of lack of or unclear communication, someone being distracted, if we think about mobile phones and driving, anything as simple as that, a lack of or inadequate resources, stress, increased stress, complacency, where you think it's all going to be fine, mate, no problems. The lack of teamwork, where there's a bit of an assumption of what's going to happen and nobody communicates. Normally they're linked, and things don't happen. There's disjointedness. Someone goes off and does something they're not supposed to. The pressure, whether that's actual or perceived, because to the individual, regardless which way it is, it's real. A lack of awareness, and that's that situational awareness, being unable to anticipate what is going to happen next. A lack of knowledge, an assumption that somebody knows how to do something, but they don't have the courage or the ability, or the culture's not set for them to speak up to say, I don't understand. Fatigue, lack of sleep, and you could probably put in there any health condition. Lack of assertiveness, and this is when someone is not willing or won't tell the boss or the owner that things aren't right, or they've got a better idea of how to do stuff because they're afraid, or they're not comfortable, or they're not confident. So assertiveness is different from aggressiveness. It's about saying, I believe, I think. And it's a really key method to enable people to say when things are getting too much. And the last one is norms. So that's the culture. So it'd be really interesting to see if any of you have experienced any of those things in relation to an event or an incident at home or workplace. So the next thing is, as you talk about that, it's really important to have a look at those errors and then think about where your focus is when you're managing pressure. So there's a couple of key things. So we've got to look at, and this has come from Stephen Covey, the 7 habits of highly effective people. And but it's adjusted slightly for the environment we're in. So the control part is the things basically that you directly affect. So it's basically your reaction and your responses, your decisions and behaviours. You are the one responsible for those. It's about accountability. It's about accepting that accountability and understanding what you have decided and owning it. So owning those mistakes and owning those because you have control. And we'll talk a little bit about how that changes when you're having a bad day versus a good day. So it'd be interesting to see if you have a think about that. How does your reaction or response change to a comment or someone's actions depending on how you're feeling in that day, what your state is for that day? The next one is the things that you can influence. So the things like the people around you, their reactions and responses, you can influence those, particularly as a manager or a boss or a leader within your organization. You can manage and you can adjust and you can influence those and you can influence the outcome, but you can't directly control it. You can't have a direct impact on it because individuals have that control. So you can only influence and guide. It's like being a player in a team and then the coach of the team. And the last one is the concern space. And these are things like the weather. We spend, I think, within farming, particularly within agriculture, spending a lot of time worrying, spending energy and workload being worried and trying to influence and change the weather, but we can't. So it's about just being concerned about it, acknowledging that it's there, and this is when you can risk manage it because you don't have control, you don't have influence, but it does impact you. So it's being concerned about it and looking how you can manage it with risk. So and we talked about response and reaction. So it'd be really interesting to see and have a chat with you afterwards about how your reactions and responses change depending on where you sit on that stress curve. I know, for instance, that with my kids and in the past with my workforce, when I was second in command of the squadron, is that my reaction to them and my responses to things I did would change depending on the stress level I was under, depending on the workload I had on my shoulders. And things would get more annoying, more frustrating. It would change. Your patience would decrease significantly in a bad day. But if you're having a great day and things were all working all nicely for you that day and you felt like you had all the time in the world, you were usually much more empathetic, more understanding, and that patience was much bigger. And that impact of others, when you talk about influence, is their impact on you as well, their language, behaviours and culture. So not just the culture of your organisation, but also the family and your community and society. And the language of behaviours is that thing of tone of voice. I'm trying to teach my 10-year-old son about it's not often what you say, it's how you say it. His tone is disrespectful, but what he said is fine. So it's very interesting about that. So it's about being aware of how people are talking to you, about how you're responding to that and how that changes the way you respond to them. and how that changes potentially the way you do a task. If someone goes up to you and says, quick, hurry, we've got to get this task done now, very urgently, and they sound really stressed and worked up, then your response and your reaction to that will probably increase your stress level and increase your workload. So being able to sometimes to step back and be aware of it and anticipate changes to be able to manage it are really important. So that leads to managing the risks. So it's about recognizing common errors or common mistakes, or anticipating changes that are coming up. If something happened a certain way last year at the same time, you could potentially expect it to happen similar this year, unless you've made significant changes. You may have put controls in place to manage that risk and manage that change. So it's really important to understand that and potentially sometimes record those changes. And as we go on, I'm going to talk a little bit now about managing that risk to try and manage the pressure. So, and I'm going to pause for 2 seconds, excuse me. And I'm back. We're going to talk about one of the last major deployments I had when I was flying the Sea King helicopter. Is the squadron was winding down, so we didn't have a lot of air crew. I was a senior instructor on the squadron, and I ended up taking the flight away with 2 aircraft and a whole bunch of personnel. And a couple of those were students, so we had to train them along the way. So the workload was extensive. We had to fly at short notice. We found out on the Thursday and we left on the Sunday. So Thursday night I came home, said I'm going away for an unknown period of time. We're leaving Sunday morning. So we had a day or 2 days basically to get our home affairs organised, get ourselves packed up and ready to go. Already the workload's increasing. We also had to plan the navigation trip and all the requirements for refuel, etc., on the way up the coast because we were meeting the ship in Townsville. We did that, and really for us at that stage, it was a fairly regular workload that happened quite often for us on our squadron, so we were quite prepared for that. We went up and joined the ship. The additional workload was while we were sailing from Townsville to Darwin, was to train a couple of guys on basically on the aircraft and deck landings and getting them back up to speed. So that was part of it. The other thing, the pressure and the workload for us on that flight was that a number of years, 4 years earlier, HMS Canimbla ship there, you can see in the picture, 2 aircraft had been sent to the Boxing Day tsunami back in 2004. And then in April 2005, they were turned around and sent to back up. They were on their way home and they were sent back up to the island of Nias to do some additional work post another earthquake. And unfortunately, one of the aircraft crashed at this time and we lost 9 personnel, 2 survived. And 4 of those were really close friends of mine. And it was a maintenance error. So there was an error made within the maintenance team, which is what started them learning about human factors. It was a catalyst that enabled maintenance to start learning about all the stuff I've been talking about this evening. And it enabled them to learn to put that in place. So myself and the senior maintenance sailor, we got together and we discussed that we were the same ship, same place, same aircraft for about the same reason. We were going back to Indonesia, so we needed to make sure we didn't allow the mission override safety. This is pretty much what we saw when we got there. So and the workload was fairly intense. So we had to be delivering stores, water, food, personnel, equipment ashore to try and help rebuild. And part of the rebuilding was basically we were helping to extend the hospital and we were building a couple of local schools while we're up there, because obviously they'd lost all of that, and having the kids unoccupied, and especially some of them who'd lost parents and family members, having them back at school saw them as getting into a good routine. So that was really important. So the mission was very important, and it continued to push, and we always had a full work day for both aircraft. We started to let basically something called mission creep come into our operations, and that's when you start to accept a greater level of risk to achieve the mission. So a risk to safety or personnel of the aircraft or personnel to achieve the mission. And that started to happen because we had an error within the aircraft. It was a minor degradation in the performance of the aircraft, and it started to creep in, and we tried to get maintenance to fix it. They couldn't work it out. We gave it to them overnight. They couldn't work it out, so we just fly it again the next morning. And this happened for a couple of days in a row, and we kept rebriefing and handing over the error or the lack of performance for the aircraft. And we would have continued on that way, and we don't even know what the outcome would have been from that lack of performance, because it was an unknown error, an unknown fault, until one of my junior aircrew came up to me and just said, after the discussion we'd had at the beginning, which I'm really glad we had, he came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder before we went flying, and he just said, "Ma'am, quick question, that fault we keep talking about, would we do that if we were at home?" And it made me really stop and think and say, no, it wouldn't. So I let the pressure and the stress and the expectation and all of those things cloud my judgment and make me made a bad decision to continue flying that aircraft with that fault. That one person's voice gave me a check, and basically I signed the aircraft back to the maintenance team and said, do not let it out until we've solved the problem. And I went up and saw the ship's captain and let him know that he'd lost one of his major assets for an unknown period of time, and I'll let him know how it's going. He took it really well and was really good about it, and I was really appreciative of that. And because we took it to him in a risk management approach, saying this is a risk if we keep flying, these are the controls we put in place, our best bet is to actually stop flying because we don't know the outcome. And that led us to looking at basically understanding risk controls. So understanding when you have a major incident or something that's happened or going to happen. So for us, it was the fault of the aircraft sat in the middle. The outcome could have been a crash. The outcome could have been someone got injured, a bad landing, or something happened, or a mission failure as we went through. The barriers to prevent that are the ones that prevent the hazard from becoming an event. And we went through that. The barriers should have been our briefing, should have been our maintenance crew, but we didn't allow that to, we allowed that to not work. They weren't working, basically. And then the recovery controls are the things on the other side, the things that stop us from having that accident. And that one person's voice stopped us from having the accident. So recovery controls reduce the consequence of the outcome if the event happens. So the events happen, but the consequence reduced because of that. So I'm going to give you a couple examples, but we might talk about, if you want to put in the Slido, maybe what are some of the controls or barriers you can think about. So personal protective equipment is a recovery control. So the events happened, personal protective equipment stops the outcome being worse. Pre-activity or pre-task briefing is a barrier. So everyone understands. It improves teamwork, improves communication. Everyone is on the same page and they all understand what's happening next. Things like yard gates, draft races are a barrier as well. They're a physical barrier because they eliminate the cattle, the sheep getting to where they're not supposed to be. But the key thing to ask yourself before it all goes wrong is ask yourself each time, are they working? Are they doing the job they're supposed to be doing? Or are they a bit broken? Are they just tied together with a bit of a wire? Is my PPE, have I only got one glove? Is there a hole in my trousers which are going to end up allowing a burn or something like that? So make sure that your controls are working. Now to finish off, I'm just going to chuck up a couple of takeaways. So it's really important when you're dealing with a lot of pressure and high workload to understand your physical, your personal state. It enables you to improve communication, teamwork. It enables to make decisions at the right time when you're in a good state to make those particular decisions, because hindsight is wonderful, but we don't have that when we're making the decision, because you make the best decision for your state at the time with the information you have. And if you make it when you're not in a good state, then potentially the outcome will be bad. It enables you as well, understanding to manage the workload. You can actually have more capacity, more ability to deal with the stress and pressure if you know and you're dealing with it in a fit, high performance state, if you're in a good place. So know how you are physically and mentally. And if you're not at the best, can you delegate? And as I said, defer or delay. And remember that your state is influenced by not only your own personal actions, but it can be influenced by those around you, how they speak, how they behave, the culture of the organisation and the environment you're in. If it's too hot, too cold or uncomfortable, you're not going to be able to perform at your best. And is the influence of those things positive or not? And if it's not, what can you do about it? because there are only certain things that you can control. If you're the boss, you can control and do something about it. If, for example, the equipment's not good enough or doesn't work. But if you're the worker, you may be only be able to influence what is happening there. And remember, don't spend a lot of energy trying to change those things are concerns, but use risk management to manage the problem. And thank you so much. So I'm open to questions.
Thanks, Natalie. I will these questions. One question that's come through is, what is the best way to go about having conversations around workload or heightened stress with supervisors when they have the tendency to have high expectations?
A lot of that is it's about that assertiveness that I spoke about. It's about being able to, and you can use a risk management technique as well to talk about how you're kind of a barrier to potentially an incident from happening, and using I statements. So I worked with a couple of people who were very much like that. And for me to express myself, I couldn't say that this particular thing wasn't working. I had to say I felt that this was a problem. And the best thing to do as well is you have that, then also try and have an alternative solution. So you can say, this amount of workload isn't achievable for us or for me, or I feel this isn't achievable because of the following reasons. But if we do it CBA instead of ABC, it will work much better for us. It's about having that, it's that thing where supervisors, managers, particularly those who've got high expectations, don't want you to come with a problem. They want you to come with a problem and a solution. And ideally, if you can come with 3 solutions, and managers and supervisors, block your ears here, if you come with 3 solutions, make sure one of them is outstandingly better than the other 2, because that's the one you want. It's a basic technique, and if you always can come with 3 and one of them is the one you want, you make the others really bad, and normally they will go the way you want it to. I hope that's useful.
Thank you. If there's any other questions, we probably have time for one more, or we will wrap up. No. So thank you, Natalie, for your insights into working under pressure and you sharing your incredible journey. It's been great. There is just an evaluation survey to fill out for your guests. But yeah, thank you for everyone who joined us tonight for tonight's webinar. Natalie, thank you for sharing some great information about performing under pressure. If you have any, oh, sorry, you go.
I was just going to say thank you so much. And if any questions pop up afterwards, please reach out to Ellie or the team at Agrista, and I'm happy to answer them afterwards offline.
Yeah, awesome. If you have any, additional questions, do reach out. And thank you again for attending, and we look forward to you joining us for our next webinar, where we will be talking about integration of livestock into a mixed farming systems with Ed Riegel. If you have missed any of last month's webinars, head over to the MLA and Agrista website to watch them as well. Be sure to check out our podcast series. You can find it on all major podcast platforms under Productivity and Profitability Media Series. Happy listening, and thank you again for joining.